As Israel continues its complete siege and bombing of Gaza, in an UpFront special, we discuss how the war is being presented in the West and whether there is any hope for a ceasefire. Following Hamas's deadly October 7th attack that claimed the lives of more than 1,000 Israelis, including hundreds of civilians, Israel retaliated, heavily bombing the Gaza Strip. While much of the West expressed solidarity with Israel, asserting its right to self-defense, human rights groups have also condemned Israel's disproportionate response. More than 4,000 people, including hundreds of children, have been killed and at least 1 million displaced, which raises concerns about potential violations of international law. With tensions running high, violence has spread outside of Gaza, with attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic attacks on the rise globally. Joining us to discuss this all in Tel Aviv is Haggai Matar, Executive Director of Plus 972 magazine. In Philadelphia, Noura Erakat, a human rights law scholar and associate professor at Rutgers University. And here in the studio with me is Lara Friedman, President of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you all for joining me. Haggai, I'm going to start with you. We've seen the dire situation in Gaza. Schools and hospitals destroyed, residents struggling to get basic necessities. I mean, water, for example. But violence against Palestinians has drastically risen in the occupied West Bank. At least 58 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and there are reports that 2 villages have been depopulated. The situation has become increasingly unsustainable for Palestinians. At least 229 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of this year. Can you talk about the reasons behind this escalation of violence, and particularly in the West Bank?
Yes, of course. Well, we're getting reports even as we speak about additional communities that are being displaced and ethnically cleansed. So we're seeing a move by the settlers, a very intentional move to capture on the fact that the world's attention is on Gaza right now, and that Israel is getting so much solidarity and support from the world that nobody would care. And de facto, we're seeing settlers day after day, night after night, attacking Palestinian communities and really pushing them out, destroying entire villages. So that is happening as we speak. Like you said, over 60 people killed, but it's less of a new beginning, just an escalation of what we've seen in recent years, and especially over the past year, with the Israeli government really giving a free hand for settlers to attack Palestinian communities. The pattern is usually of settlers attacking a Palestinian community. They're accompanied by soldiers. They would set fire to Palestinian houses or cars, or just attack people. And if Palestinians try to defend themselves by throwing stones, the army would jump in and start shooting at the people who are defending themselves, often killing Palestinians. We've seen a lot of that in recent days, but also over the past year. And that is a culmination of about 2 years of escalating violence in the West Bank. The PA is essentially non-functional. It is not offering Palestinians any defense. The Israeli army and police are not offering Palestinians any defense. And settlers are becoming more and more emboldened in these attacks. While at the same time, the army itself is also attacking, invading Palestinian cities in the West Bank. And this is a pattern that we've seen escalate over the past 2 years.
Noura, it's not just that the Israeli government is watching as settlers are engaging in more intensified acts of violence and more frequent acts of violence. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir said on Tuesday that Israel began distributing assault rifles to civilian security teams. That's the language they use, civilian security teams inside of settlements. What does that mean, and how does that bode when we think about de-escalation, peace agreements, stability, any of these things?
I think that it's important to put this in a broader context of what Israel has done in its settler colonization efforts. And I think that we should be mindful that in this situation, what is happening is an ongoing bid to remove Palestinians from their homes, not just since '67, but since Israel's establishment in 1948, and to replace them with settlers. This is happening obviously in the West Bank. It's happening in the ethnic cleansing of the villages and the Judaization known as ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. It is happening in the south of Israel in the Naqab, and it's happening through warfare in the Gaza Strip by removing Palestinians, the forced population transfer, the shrinking of the perimeter of the coastal enclave in order to take more land without the people.
Lara, this picture that Noura is painting makes this far more complicated than just a war that will begin and end. She's talking about a historic process. She's talking about a settler colonial project that seems to have the sanction not just of the state, but in some ways maybe the global community. What do you make of that?
Look, I think if you understand what's happening in Gaza through the lens of Israel trying to, exactly what Noura said, trying to shrink the enclave, trying to get more Palestinians out and take more land. If you look at what's happening in the West Bank, the violence that Haggai is talking about isn't random. We're in the process of finally clearing out Palestinians from Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank. Danny Seideman, who's talked for years about the part of the Israeli public which wants to finish the 1948 war. They say there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The 1948 war isn't done. And finishing it means establishing and completing Israeli sovereignty over all the land between the river and the sea. And that means depopulating of Palestinians as best one can and limiting the presence and the rights of those that you can't move.
Noura, in recent years, we saw some progress, some pushback against the conditions that you're describing. Then October 7th happens, and it feels like, in many ways, we've been reset, that we're back to square one again. We're literally seeing media representations where people are attending a ceasefire rally or a pro-Palestinian rights rally or something designed to stop the violence that we see right now and fight for justice. And we've seen media outlets refer to them as pro-Hamas rallies or pro-ISIS rallies. We've seen misinformation, disinformation spread in ways that undermines free speech rights for the people doing the protesting. What role does the media play in escalation here?
I think that the media, the mainstream media, has abdicated its responsibility and journalistic integrity in order to report, to question, to investigate, to ask really hard questions. Instead, they have been propagating what seems to be a U.S. government line, a U.S. government that has provided unequivocal support, financial, military, economic, to Israel, that has used its veto power, now the 44th veto, to undermine, in this moment, a ceasefire, and historically, to undermine an international resolution and any accountability to Israel. And rather than a media corps exercising its journalistic skills and responsibility in order to push back and to push hard, we see them propagating these lies. We see them actually fomenting violence and war by using Islamophobic tropes, by building on the infrastructure of the war on terror, by running headlines that this is a hostage crisis as opposed to a political crisis, by describing this as a war between Israel and Gaza or Israel and Hamas, when in fact this is a war against all Palestinians and a continuing process. The mere fact.
No, let me interrupt you for a second, because in addition to the ethical and moral dimensions of this, from a legal perspective, you're an international human rights attorney. How culpable are media outlets potentially if they run a story or a headline or make a claim that foments violence?
They are very culpable. I made this point yesterday when we were looking at what the BBC ran a headline 24 hours before the bombing of the Al Ahli hospital that said, does Hamas run tunnels underneath hospitals and schools? Immediately, what triggered for me is a point to remind the journalistic corps that the Genocide Convention holds individuals to account not merely for the commitment of genocide, but for genocidal intent, for aiding it, for being complicit in it. By running that headline, by perpetuating this idea that there are no Palestinian civilians, as the President Isaac Herzog said, without pushing back, as accepting without criticism the genocidal intent that was articulated by the Israeli Minister of Defense, that Palestinians are human animals and they will impose a complete siege, preventing the access of water and electricity and humanitarian corridors. They are actually being complicit.
Haggai, help me understand this from within the Israeli and Palestinian context. You're on the ground. Are we seeing similar opposition to pro-Palestinian voices?
Yes, definitely. But I want to start slightly before that with the effects of the October 7th attack. I do think that it broke something very essential in the discourse. There's a huge challenge that we're facing right now. I mean, the very real reality of Palestinians massacring hundreds of unarmed Israeli civilians at a field where there was just a dance party, people that were murdered, slaughtered in their homes. I mean, that reality with over 1,300 victims, most of them civilians. I think it's only natural. It only makes sense that for a lot of people there would be this feeling of we have supported, the Palestinian struggle or the struggle for justice, but now it's making it much more difficult to support. And this is something we all need to contend with. How do we create or sustain a discourse about Palestinian justice and about Palestinian liberation and about resisting apartheid, and at the same time being consecutive in rejecting these war crimes against Israelis? I think that complexity is missing in so many spaces. Leading amongst them is the Israeli discourse, where, of course, the only prevailing narrative, and this connects to what Noura is saying, is we are only the victims. See what they're doing to us. We are only the victims here. We're only defending ourselves. And that reality is leading to what we're seeing now on the ground, which is persecution of anyone saying anything that is at the slightest critical of the government. So that reality, alongside dozens of Palestinians who have been arrested, fired, or suspended from universities in Israel, that is part of the persecution that's happening because there's absolutely no room for criticism of the government policies following October 7th.
On Wednesday, Molotov cocktails were hurled at a synagogue in the center of Berlin, and there have been reports of swastikas spray painted at schools and on buildings in the United States. Lara, incidents like these have certainly increased since October 7th. Do you foresee this getting worse?
So I don't know about the data in the United States on incidents like these in the United States increasing. There has been incidents of anti-Palestinian violence in the United States, including a 6-year-old child stabbed to death in Chicago, including someone in Michigan arrested because he advertised, "Who wants to come with me to Dearborn?" And I think he said, "Hunt Palestinians." We've seen videos online of people raging against Palestinian protesters in ways that if they did this against pro-Israel protesters, they would be certainly arrested. It would be called anti-Semitism.
Do you also implicate the media in that? And specifically what you're talking about was Saturday, the 14th, a Palestinian mother and son were stabbed in Illinois by their landlord. The 6-year-old boy was stabbed 26 times, later dying of his wounds. And detectives determined that the mother and son were targeted in light of them, quote, being Muslim and the ongoing Middle Eastern conflict involving Hamas and the Israelis. This is from the police. What role does the media play in making this stuff
The media
worse?
plays a tremendous role. I believe the rest of that article says that the wife said that her husband was taken over by these ideas because of watching right-wing media. The challenge here, when we talk about anti-Semitism in the same conversation we're talking about Gaza or anti-Palestinianism, is that for years, those who want to shut down criticism of Israel, advocacy for Palestinian rights, have argued that it is a form of anti-Semitism.
Right.
And throughout even the Trump era, when we did have actual surging anti-Semitism coming from, fascists and Nazis, right? Classic anti-Semitism. People who, the people who are supposed to be taking care of and fighting anti-Semitism always made sure to say and left and the right, as if there's some equivalence. Because when we start talking about anti-Semitism, the argument that I've made for years is, if you are blaming all Jews for the actions of Israel, that is anti-Semitic. At the same time, defenders of Israel are saying, if you do not recognize that defense of Palestinians is criticism of Jews, that Jews in Israel for this context are indistinguishable, that's anti-Semitism. And I worry with the incredible surging violence that we're seeing right now as the organized Jewish community, the government of Israel, the government of the United States, frames this explicitly as attacks on Jews, that disagreeing with what Israel is doing in Gaza is an attack on the Jewish people. I worry that there's going to be blowback, absolutely. that isn't because the fight for Palestinian rights is intrinsically anti-Semitic. It's because those who want to defend Israel from criticism are insisting that you cannot distinguish between Jews and Israel. That worries me tremendously.
It's interesting, Noura, because it seems that the West, particularly dominant Western nations, have one disposition about human rights violations, about illegal actions for most countries. And then when it comes to Palestine, there seems to be an exception. I'll give you an example. Since the October 7th attack by Hamas, a majority of Western powers have stood in support of Israel. Now, I want to juxtapose that to 2022, when the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, gave a speech calling out Russia's targeting of Ukrainian civilians. Let's have a listen.
Targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating with the winter coming, these are acts of pure terror. And we have to call it as such.
You know, they're saying these attacks, cutting off electricity, all this stuff is inexcusable, it's illegal, et cetera, and yet these very same nations, these very same forces who have stood up when it was Russia-Ukraine are now not just complicit in their silence, they are actively supporting Israel's response.
You know, I think in this moment we have to contend with the fact that we are not in a post-colonial reality, but the colonialism continues to shape our lives. It's in the same way that genocide was practiced very much before it was proscribed in 1949, but it was never recognized when it was committed by colonial powers against brown and black peoples, but it becomes recognized when it was practiced within Europe's borders. There is a continuing colonial reality that is shaping how Palestinians have been excluded even from the juridical category of the civilian, one that echoes American jurists in their genocidal warfare against Native Americans who have articulated that Native Americans are savages and to whom the laws of war, even dating back to the Lieber Code, the first articulation of humanitarian law during the Civil War, excluded Native Americans from the category of civilians that made their massacre plausible. And so we need to remember we are still existing in that colonial reality, one in which these former colonial powers and in some cases ongoing colonial powers have excluded Palestinians from this category and have found it far easier and more morally compatible with their lack of principle to support Israel in genocidal warfare than it has been to support Palestinians in an ongoing decolonization struggle.
Haggai, how is international support being viewed inside of Israel from these various countries, but particularly the United States?
Well, it's seen as exactly what it is, a green light to do whatever this government wants to do. It's both international support, of course, you know, the US with its aircraft carriers and fleet moored just outside of Israel is a significant part of that. The international support is a part of that. And picking up on what Lara was saying, you can see these, you know, very heartfelt speeches by President Biden saying, you know, that he wants to reassure Israelis of their safety and security and that they have a future and they have allies. And that's beautiful. That's great. But at the same time, you realize that what that means is that he's not saying the same things to Palestinians. He's not telling the dozens of Palestinian families that were wiped out in Gaza, he's not telling their relatives, your lives matter, and we want to protect you as well. We're telling Israelis that their lives matter and they can do to you whatever they want. That is what Israelis are picking up from this. I think that is what Biden means, and that's how it's being utilized.
So I want you all to give me your best insights. What are the chances of a ceasefire? Noura, I'll start with you.
I just want to start by saying that before I got onto this program, I asked, you know, several people to help me just search for the names of the Palestinians who were massacred in the Al Ahli hospital. I think that there has been part of the dehumanization project, aside from the fact that we're getting clear that there's no principle that all civilian life is sacred. But aside from that, the fact that Palestinian death toll is just shared with us in astonishing numbers in ways that are actually dehumanizing Palestinians, because we are not getting the extent of pain For each life lost, we are not getting the extent of pain of all the beloveds and the kin that are watching this and being traumatized, of the babies who are left without any family around them, who are to wake up to a world orphaned and abandoned by the world that is blaming them for their own misery and only proposing to them that we're going to keep you in tighter cages in order to resolve this issue. So here I just want to emphasize to an audience watching, at what number will trigger the horror that should have been triggered already of Palestinian death? Is it 10,000? Is it 100,000? We have been asking this question since the debilitating siege was imposed on the Gaza Strip. And so the fact that we can't see that number within any plain sight speaks the deep dehumanization, the racial discourse, the colonial discourse that has basically primed audiences to accept Palestinian death and slow death as tragic but necessary, which is obscuring the fact, back to your question, Mark, where is the ceasefire, regardless of this red herring of who bombed the hospital. There should be an unequivocal call, because of the horror and the atrocity, for an immediate ceasefire. Israel has done enough. It killed 16 paramedics. It has denied electricity to hospitals where babies cannot survive in incubators because of a lack of electricity. It has cut off water. It has carbon-bombed humanitarian convoys that are trying to travel to the south. That's not enough, that now it becomes necessary to debate whether or not this was actually an Israeli airstrike. If there is really the fog of war is making everything unclear, then lift the fog and impose an immediate ceasefire. Why did the U.S. veto that resolution in the Security Council proposed by Brazil? So this is where we're at, and I urge all viewers that at this point, a ceasefire is the bare minimum and absolutely necessary.
Bare minimum and absolutely necessary, Noura Erakat says. Haggai, is it likely?
I'm afraid not. I completely agree with Noura. It is necessary. I think a ceasefire, release of the civilian captives that Hamas is holding, and then moving on to negotiations to first release the rest of the prisoners of war on both sides. All of this is absolutely necessary, paving the way for future negotiations as well. It is highly unlikely, if there was any hope at all of a Biden visit, putting limits on Israel's use of force, saying, forget it, ground invasion. There's been enough death, enough suffering. You need to stop now. We've actually seen the opposite, and therefore it is quite likely now that Israel will go ahead with a planned ground invasion. That could take days, that could take weeks, and a ceasefire seems further away now than it did for the past week or so.
Is that your sense too, Lara?
So I'm going to give a slightly longer answer as well. As someone who's been watching the Israeli political narrative evolve over decades, and the growing normalization of the far right Kahanist narrative. This is essentially the narrative which says Palestinians, this is our land, the Palestinians should never have been here, they are obstacles to our state, they must be removed. And that is where the mainstream is, I think, very much in Israel today, where you see with this government. There are officials within this Israeli government that are talking very clearly about taking land, about cutting the size of the Gaza Strip. When you tell 1 million people to leave half the Gaza Strip, I think of South Lebanon. Israel has a military doctrine which says we fight people on their land, not ours. It is inconceivable to me that Israel will stop this before they have laid the groundwork for them to stay permanently in a depopulated part of Gaza. You have language about trying to get humanitarian corridors, humanitarian is in quotes here, out of Gaza into the Sinai. People need to think about what that means. That is basically talking about setting up the equivalent of prison camps for Palestinians in the desert. And maybe they'll be able to bribe Sisi into doing that. But that's the goal here. I don't think you're going to get a ceasefire until Israel has accomplished whatever goals they've decided. I don't think their end game is explicitly clear. And the last thing I want to say, when we say a ceasefire is the bare minimum, let's be clear. Based on what is already done, if there was a ceasefire today, the humanitarian catastrophe that has been caused in Gaza will take years, just on a humanitarian basis, to recover from. So ceasefire is not the end of the game, but my God, it is a bare minimum if you have any sense of humanity.
Lara Friedman, Haggai Matar, Noura Erakat, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone, that is our show. Up Front, we'll be back next week.